Welcome to week 3 of the Trailblazers series. I'm Andrew Thompson, the youth minister here at Lebanon Road Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee, and so glad that you have joined us for this series today. As I stated last week, if you're just joining us this week, it's okay. This doesn't go in any kind of order. We're just using this series to look at some unsung heroes of the Bible that are women. And so today we're going to look at one whose name is Rizpah. You may not recognize that name. It's sort of buried in scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 21, but I hope by the end of this lesson you'll know a little bit more about her. So to give you a little bit background before we get to 2 Samuel 21, King Saul had been killed in a battle against the Philistines, and David had taken over as king. And Israel was in the midst of a 3-year famine. And David is going to ask the Lord, why are we experiencing this famine? In 2 Samuel 21, verse 1, the Lord told him it was because Saul and his bloodthirsty house had killed the Gibeonites. You see, the Lord was angry over Saul's treatment of the Gibeonites. And it was because they had made a vow earlier with Joshua, about 400 years earlier. If you look in Joshua chapter 9, verses 3 through 27, we read the account of how Joshua was tricked by the Gibeonites into making a covenant of peace with their people. And it allowed them to remain in the promised land instead of driving them out with the other nations that God commanded. But Saul broke this covenant. And in doing so, he thought that he was doing right. But it was an act of obedience regardless of his intentions. In 2 Samuel 21 verse 2, we see the reason why Saul thought this was a good thing. He said, these people are not the people of Israel. They're not of these people. In fact, they're remnants of the Amorites. And so you can imagine that Saul thought that this was a good idea to kill the Gibeonites because they weren't of ancestry with the people of Israel. But God remembered the covenant, and he remembered that an atonement had to be made for what Saul had done. And in order to end this famine, an atonement had to be made with the Gibeonite people. And so we're going to begin reading in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 through 6. David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." And so David approaches the Gibeonites, and he says to them, "What can we do in order to make this right? What can we do to atone for the sins of King Saul?" And the Gibeonites didn't want earthly possessions, gold or silver, and they didn't want any man put to death in Israel on their behalf. Instead, they demanded that 7 descendants of Saul be given over to them, because Saul was the man who consumed and plotted against them. And so they wanted these descendants to be delivered to them and hanged in the city of Gibeah before the Lord. And so David says, "I will give them to them." If you look at verse 7, it's interesting to note that David spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan and Saul's grandson, because of the vow of kindness he had made to him in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And so he spares one of Saul's descendants. If we keep reading verses 8 and 9, it says, "The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armani and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Moabite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, and the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of barley harvest. So David chooses 7 of Saul's family members, as you can see in these verses. And 2 of those people were sons of Rizpah, who was Saul's concubine. And they were put to death by hanging at the beginning of the barley harvest. And according to the Hebrew calendar, the barley harvest would occur in the month of Nisan, which corresponds with around late March, early April. So this is all happening sort of in what we would consider the springtime. And so how does Rizpah come into play to this? We see that 2 of her sons were chosen to be an atonement for the sins of King Saul. We see that 2 of her sons were hanged in a public place to be an atonement for King Saul's sins. Rizpah is first mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 7, where she is described as being a concubine of Saul. In those times, a concubine was a woman living in a lawful marriage arrangement with a man, but their status was considered to be less than a wife. Concubines were respected, they had legal rights, and their children were regarded as legitimate, although the children of the wife or wives were most often given preference in matters of inheritance. And so Rizpah, this concubine of Saul, has 2 sons with Saul, Armani and Mephibosheth. Saul had died, and her sons had been chosen to atone for their father's wrongdoings, which would leave Rizpah completely alone as a single mom without children now. And so imagine the excruciating sorrow that she's feeling right now. Not only did her sons have to die a gruesome death, but they were also denied a proper burial, and they were shown no dignity in the way that they died. In fact, if you were left hanging outside of the city of Gibeah, it was a symbol of justice and restitution. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, it was commanded that a body not be left hanging overnight on a tree. It was a defilement to the land, and the one who was hanged was considered a curse to God. And so Rizpah is in a very interesting situation as a mom who wants to still have her sons present, who wants to see them honored and in a dignified way, who wants to see their death be dignified instead of embarrassing as they hang in front of the public to see. So how is she going to respond? Verse 10, then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until rain upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. So Rizpah, who's motivated by mother's love, took matters into her own hands. She took a sackcloth, she spread it on the rock at the place where her sons and Saul's 5 grandsons were hanging, and she guarded over their bodies. She took watch over them. She protected them from birds. She protected them from other animals that might come and try to feed on the body. This is a picture of a loving mother who is stationed at the feet of her dead sons, driving away animals in the light of day and in the darkness of night so that they would receive the honor they deserved. Rizpah's not going to give up. In verse 10, we're also given an indication how long that she stayed there, how long that she remained with them, protecting them. It says, from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. And so we know from the previous verses that the barley harvest was taking place at that time, which occurred in the spring months of March and April. Late rains, according to the Hebrew calendar, came Marcheva, which corresponds with our fall months of October and November. So, think about how long that is, from March and April to October, November. She stayed there. Again, God could have chosen an earlier time for the rain to fall, but if the scripture is presenting a literal time frame, then Rizpah persevered for 6 months, watching over her sons day and night at the place where they were killed. How is she able to do it? How is she able to stay at post and continue through these duties for 6 months with probably little to eat and little to drink and little rest for 6 months? Well, if you're a mom watching this, how would you do it? What would give you the strength to carry on? The love of her sons. She was devoted to them, which caused her to persevere in the hope that her cause would be recognized. And it was. It was. Let's keep reading in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 11 through 14. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin, in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all the king had commanded, and after that God responded to the plea for the land. Someone went back to King David, and someone told King David of Rizpah's love, devotion, and sacrifice, and it touched his heart. David's conscience was moved not only to bury the sons of Rizpah and the other 5 men, but also to properly bury the bones of King Saul and his son Jonathan. If you go back to the last chapter of 1 Samuel, it tells of the death of Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, in a battle against the Philistines, and how the body of Saul was hung on display by his enemies. Some men from Jabesh Gilead had gone and removed the bodies of Saul and his sons and returned to Jabesh, and they burned the bodies and buried the bones in their land. And so King Saul and David's friend Jonathan had never received a proper burial. And so David chose to not only give a proper burial to the ones who hanged for Saul's sins, but also give a proper burial to King Saul and Jonathan. And so what do we learn from all of this? What do we learn from Rizpah? What do we learn from King David in this narrative that we read today? First of all, there is power in one. Rizpah stood alone, and through her love and persistence changed the heart of a king. Powerful actions don't have to be nation-saving. They don't have to be spy rescuing or vigil making. They can come in the form of encouraging words, simple gestures, or prayer. For example, say you walk up to somebody and you say, "You're a good mom." That can mean the world to a young mother who's just struggled through a whole worship service trying to contain their kid, trying to teach them how to act during worship. Maybe they feel frazzled in that moment. And so you have now given them words of encouragement and validation. Maybe sending a note of thanks to somebody goes a long way. Maybe the food you make for a grieving family. Maybe it's inviting a friend who's struggling to a church function. And that invitation could be a life-changing one. You've probably heard the saying, God uses ordinary people for accomplishing extraordinary things. There was nothing extraordinary about Rizpah. She was a concubine of Saul. She was thought lesser than his wives. Her sons probably struggled to be counted as equal with his other sons that came from his wives. But yet, she was able to do an extraordinary thing through God. And God used her to show us all the beauty and the power of one and the beauty of a mother's love. So I want you to think about this. How has one person, one word, one gesture, how has that had a profound impact on your life? The second thing that we can learn from Rizpah is take a stand for what is right and what is just, even when no one else will, and you will receive the blessing of your king. Rizpah made certain that her sons had a proper burial, even though it meant she stood alone for months in harrowing conditions as she struggled to survive, physically survive, with food and water as she stood there by her son's sides. It was not right for them to be treated so indignantly. In the end, Rizpah was blessed for her actions. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, it says, God rewards those who diligently seek him. In Psalm chapter 5, verse 12, it says, he blesses those who are righteous. Rizpah never gave up. She continued day and day and day, night after night after night. And her actions got back to the king. And the king blessed her for her perseverance through all of this by giving her sons the proper burial they deserved. Day after day after day, night after night after night, do we diligently seek God? We're told that he rewards those who do. We're told that he blesses those who are righteous. So I want you to think about the account in the book of Daniel and read Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 and Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. I want you to consider this. What does it mean that Daniel purposed in his heart and set his heart to understand? How did this help Daniel when it came to making the right choices? Because learning from that account could also help us to understand what we can learn by making right choices. The third thing that we can learn is to demonstrate persistent determination in prayer. Just as Rizpah never gave up on her appeal to the king, we should also not give up on our appeals to our king. In Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 7, Jesus told his disciples a parable about not losing heart in their prayers. He described a widow in a city who cried out to the judge for justice from her enemies. The judge did not fear God, nor did he have respect for others, and he was pestered by the widow continually for a period of time. Finally, the judge avenged her just because he was tired of being troubled by her request. Jesus said in Luke 18, verse 7, and shall God not avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? In essence, Jesus was asking his disciples if the unjust judge would grant the request of the widow, will God not answer the prayers of his own people who cry out to him day and night? In Matthew 7:7, Jesus said, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. And the verbs there, ask, seek, and knock, are expressed in the present active imperative form. So in other words, it says, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Be persistent and determined in your prayers. Never quit praying. God will answer. He is concerned about you and he's collecting your tears. Rizpah never quit praying. And her king, David, answered her cries. So let's consider this. How do we grow stronger in our persistence in prayer? The fourth and the last thing that we can learn from this account of Rizpah is to love faithfully and sacrificially. When we read 1 Corinthians 13, I think of Rizpah. When I read the words in verse 4, love suffers long, I visualize Rizpah at the feet of her sons, driving away the animals and birds of prey. In verse 7, when it says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, I imagine Rizpah battling hunger, exhaustion, and fear as she pursued justice for her sons. In verse 8, when Paul writes, love never fails, I picture Rizpah enduring the ridicule of others, ignoring her own needs, and suffering through her own grief until David took notice. Can you imagine what the people said about her as they watched her day and night watch over the bodies of her dead sons? Nothing could separate Rizpah from the vigil she held by the bodies of her sons. And the Bible also tells us in Romans chapter 8 at the end of the chapter that nothing can separate us from the love of God. So as we close with this lesson, consider this question. In what ways do you sacrifice for those you love? Are we like Rizpah? Are we determined in our prayer life? Do we sacrificially love others? Do we stand alone when it's not easy? That's the things that Rizpah taught us. That's the trail that she blazed for us to follow. Thanks for joining us today.